Good morning to everyone. I want to get started now. We have a lineup of speakers, including a keynote. But first, I would like to just contextualize this a little bit. The Dean of the Faculty of Political Science is not free today, so I'll just say this on behalf of the faculty. We welcome Japan Foundation representatives, all the guest speakers, Professor Tanaka, and I'll introduce you in a moment, the other speakers. You will notice that the name of the support and the name of the public forum is the Mekong region, Mekong on more minds, which means that the Mekong has been on many minds to begin with, but I think it's getting more currency and it's appearing on more minds. We also have the collaboration today with Japan. You'll notice we've had in the past collaboration with the Chinese think tanks and academics, but today we're working with Japan on Mekong issues. It's a broad topic we have: geopolitics, geoeconomics of the region, mainland Southeast Asia. Sometimes I call it the Mekong mainland. And this is CLMTV: Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, plus southern China, Yunnan, Guangxi. So that's the kind of the broad canvas of our frame, our discussion today. Before we begin, I want to invite the Director General of the Japan Foundation, our partner and co-organizer, co-host for today, Mr. Norihiko Yoshioka. Now you have all the bios of everyone who's going to be on stage and speaking today, so I'm not going to go into full details, but Mr. Yoshioka has been with Japan Foundation a long time. He's risen up through the ranks. He also has had publications as well. And he's in charge of Japan Foundation in Bangkok. So please, may I invite you to provide some opening remarks.
Your Excellencies, honorable speakers, and distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all here today to this important public forum that brings together prominent scholars and experts from Japan and the countries along to the Mekong River, and to discuss about the entitled Mekong on More Minds, the Geopolitics and Geoeconomics of Mainland Southeast Asia. And the year 2019 marks the 10th anniversary since Japan and the Mekong region countries declared the year 2009 as Mekong-Japan Exchange Year. And in the last 10 years, we have witnessed the remarkable development of the region, thanks to a plethora of projects, initiatives, and investment both by public and private sectors. And we, the Japan Foundation, as Japan's public entity for promoting cultural exchanges, we also have made our best efforts to strengthen cultural ties between the Mekong region countries and Japan. And since 2014, in particular, through its newly established unit called Asia Center within the foundation, we have implemented a lot of cultural events, including lectures, public seminars, and art exhibitions, stage performances, film festivals, and football matches, to name the few. And this forum is also a part of our continuous efforts to strengthen mutual understanding through dialogues and discussions. If I am asked what brought the biggest impact on the Mekong country regions, I would, of course, have to say and admit that it is the drastic rise of China and her Belt and Road Initiative since 2013. But at the same time, interestingly, the Japan's counter-initiative, so-called Open and Free Indo-Pacific strategy, has been gradually substantiated over the years. So at this commemorative year of the 10th anniversary of Mekong-Japan Exchange Year, it is very timely to look back and look forward the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of the region. I do hope this forum will provide you stimulating inspiration and ideas to think further about mainland Southeast Asia, along with Japan and beyond. And last but not least, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to Dr. Thitinan Pongsudhirak and his team, your team, for co-hosting this event by providing this wonderful venue and also extending the invitation to your networks. And also I would like to express my deepest thanks to our honorable speakers for your kind participation in this forum. Your participation is really, really valuable for us. So again, welcome to this forum, and I wish fruitful and productive discussions and also a productive exchange of ideas. Thank you very much.
Now, before I introduce Professor Tanaka, Professor Akihiko Tanaka, I'll just contextualize a little bit. You'll see from his bio that he's a prolific author. He's associated and known for being associated with the University of Tokyo. He was a professor there many years, international relations, international studies. He also became a vice rector, vice president at a point. But before he became the president of GRIPS. So GRIPS is a professional school, postgraduate school based in Tokyo. And I think it's the Graduate Research Institute for Policy Studies, I think it's a full name. GRIPS, like a grip with an S, is very well known professional school. Before Professor Tanaka became the president, he also was a president of JICA, and held other positions and public sector roles internationally in his illustrious past, you can see from his bio. But what I want to single out is one of his books. Reminds me reading the bio now that I actually went through your book almost 20 years ago, and the book was called The New Middle Ages. The New Middle Ages, the world system in the 21st century. This is a very broad, my kind of topic. And in fact, I remember that book, I think Professor Tanaka was prescient, forward-looking in that book, because many of the things that the trends and the themes that were covered in that book, we've seen manifesting over the last couple of decades, since 2002. So Professor Tanaka is not going to speak strictly on the Mekong region. He is going to give us a broad overview of geopolitics, geoeconomics of Asia, Asia-Pacific, and Indo-Pacific. Asia-Pacific now is not as much in vogue as the Indo-Pacific. We used to refer to the region as Asia-Pacific, but now that has been replaced more or less by Indo-Pacific. And Japan is right smack in the middle of it, along with the US, of course. The Trump administration has been pressing and peddling this Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP strategy, although President Trump did not come to the ASEAN-related summits this time to further promote that agenda. The Indo-Pacific is very broad. So if you think of Thailand, next door is Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and thankfully we don't have a border with China, but we're very close to China. And then you think about Vietnam, so it's mainland Southeast Asia. And then if you just traverse the South China Sea, you get the maritime Southeast Asia. So this is ASEAN and Southeast Asia. And if you go a little bit further across the Pacific, you have North America, Latin America, and then up north, Northeast Asia, the Korean Peninsula, China, Japan. So roughly, on the other side, there's South Asia, the Indian Ocean. So we're going to hear from Professor Tanaka. His keynote remarks, keynote address will cover this geostrategic frame, revolving around two oceans, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And within that broad frame, we will then proceed to a panel on mainland Southeast Asia, the Mekong region, during which Professor Tanaka will join the panel, and then we'll have questions and comments after the panel discussion. Professor Tanaka, may I invite you to the podium, please?
Professor Thitinan, Mr. Yoshioka, representative of the Diplomatic Corps, students of this great university, and ladies and gentlemen. It is my really great pleasure to be back to this campus, where I had many occasions of academic interaction with the faculty members as well as students. Today I feel very honored to be invited by the sponsors of this organization to give or share my sense of what the Indo-Pacific constitutes. Let me start with a strange map here. This is actually the old map preserved in Japan, concretely Ryukoku University. It is supposed to be originated from the early 1402. It was supposed to have been drawn in Korea about 100 years before Westerners came to this region. As it was drawn in Korea, the picture of Korea was quite prominent. I hope the pointer didn't reach that. But you see this Korean peninsula on the right-hand side. And then figure of the Yellow Sea was quite accurate. Actually, Japan was located down the Korean peninsula, located toward the southward rather than eastward. But that was Japan over there. And then you saw the sea coast of China. And then the figures which supposed to be Southeast Asia was not so accurate. But you see lots of islands. And then lots of rivers were written or drawn. And one of them surely is supposed to be the Great Mekong. And then you go down the bit, then you saw the India. And on top of the India, you have Sri Lanka. And then beyond Sri Lanka, you go to the Indian Ocean, to the Arabian Sea. Arabian Peninsula appeared very thin. And beyond the Arabian Sea, you have a Red Sea. And then really minuscule Africa with huge Lake Victoria inside. This map drawn in East Asia in late 14th, 15th century indicated that there had existed information about the great region which we now call the Indo-Pacific. Actually, before Westerners came to the Indian Ocean, there were thriving commercial relations from Arabian Peninsula to India to Southeast Asia to China and Japan by the means of sea route. I would like to simply point out the importance of the Indo-Pacific is not unprecedented. But of course, the reason why we are now talking about is the significance of the current moment in the 21st century. Although I'm not talking in detail or particularly the Mekong region, but I have to confess, as I was told, as it was introduced, during my tenure as president of JICA, it was the time when I was traveling from Da Nang to Savannah Ket. And another time I drove from Ho Chi Minh City to Phnom Penh. And then also the time when I surveyed the barren land with only cow exists on the place now called Tirawa. I thought, this is the region that connects the Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean. And then as a president of JICA, I traveled a lot in places like Chennai, India, and also went to the place called Nacala in Mozambique, and also Madagascar, where JICA has lots of projects. And then when I stood on the Nacala port, looking toward the east, over the Indian Ocean, I thought, oh, that was the direction that the Chennai exists. That was the direction that Tirawa exists. And probably by way of Dawei, we may be able to connect from Nacala to Ho Chi Minh City. And that was the time when I thought, oh, this is the time that we are living in the area called Indo-Pacific. The one graph that I would like to show is the rise of the West and the rise of Asia and the rise of Indo-Pacific. This is the data from Professor Angus Maddison, who passed away in 2011, a great economic historian who made estimates of per capita GDP of virtually all countries in the world from the year 1, most precisely from the early 19th century. And then this is the picture indicating the share of various regions of the world. And 1820, China's share was nearly 30% of the global GDP. But the 19th century was, as this graph indicates, was a period of tremendous rise of the West, depicted in sort of a bluish color. And the reddish color receded. And by the middle of 20th century, the percentage of the West rose and rose, and the percentage of Asia declined and declined. That was the time when the West dominated the global scene. And that was the time when the Atlantic was the center of economic gravity in world history. That trend changed in the late 20th century. The percentage of the Asian share, China, Japan, India, grew, and what was called the Four Dragons made a prominent role in economy, and that was the time when we talked about the shifting center of economic gravity from the Atlantic to the Asia Pacific. And if you look at the leftmost bar, the percentage of red and yellow increased to a great extent, almost equal to the bluish figure, and it indicated the rise, the percentage of China increased, but as I would like you to pay attention to what was drawn as the rest of Asia, 17%. And so it is not the time, not just the rise, simply the rise only of China, but the rise of the rest of Asia too. And then if you look at the, you have, although small, the percentage of Africa increased. And so from Asia to Africa, we are observing the expansion of economic activities. And this is a share of the world. And if you pay attention to per capita GDP, this is the per capita GDP, the rise of the West European countries, the North America, Australia, and what then was regarded as the Western countries. And in the 19th century, really the 19th century was the time when the West rose. And if you look at the figure, same figure in late 20th century, first you observed the rise of the high-income countries in East Asia. This doesn't. Australia and New Zealand were higher than Japan, but Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong rose rapidly. Korea, Taiwan followed very much. And now the Singapore's per capita GDP is really one of the top in the world. Well, incidentally, these are per capita GDP as measured by what's called purchasing power parity. So not exactly the same as the dollar value using the exchange rate. And although the scale has changed in this graph, you look at other Southeast Asian countries, they show a similarly rapid increase. Thailand, followed by China, Indonesia, Philippines, and now Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam has about more or less the similar level of per capita GDP measured by PPP. And within Asian countries, the only exception to this racing economic growth is North Korea. And this trend, as you see, this rise of the low-income countries in East Asia started in sometime in 1990. But if you look at, I think, the South Asia too, the trend, for example, in the case of India, until the late 20th century, rather stagnant, but then as those countries enter the 21st century, they started to rise very quickly. And so South Asia now joining the dynamism of East Asia. And then this is some of the countries in Eastern Africa. And Sub-Saharan Africa's economies went through tremendous difficulties in the 1980s and 1990s. As in the case of Tanzania, per capita GDP declined tremendously in the late 20th century. But as they entered 21st century, virtually all of them started to grow very much. And Sub-Saharan Africa now joining the trend of economic growth first started in northern East Asia to Southeast Asia, South Asia, and eastern coast of Sub-Saharan Africa. And the global distribution of economic wealth in 1960 were virtually dominated by North America and Western Europe. But as the year went through from 2000, Japan's GDP grew and China was catching up, and some, growing centers in Southeast Asia. But now 2016, China surpassed Japan, and then India's grew, and Southeast Asia grew. And still, Sub-Saharan Africa's economic scales are rather small, but then they became more visible. If you look at the current economic growth rate in global terms, the reddish areas are indicate that those areas where you have more than 5% growth. And those reddish areas are located from East Asia to eastern side of Africa. And IMF's projection for year 2023 continues to indicate a similar trend. According to IMF's projection, the nominal GDP by 2023 indicates this kind of distribution. East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia become very big in comparison with North America and Western Europe. If you pay attention to the trend of population, we know that China and India are dominant. But according to the UN projection, the population of Sub-Saharan Africa will surpass both China and India within some 2-3 decades. And China, by the end of this century, would be the third after Sub-Saharan Africa and India. And currently, Sub-Saharan Africa's size is quite small, but as the population grew, their size is expected to grow. And so the current population globally is shown by this map, but the projection of 2100, a lot of people live in Sub-Saharan Africa. And with this growth, if per capita GDP grew on a modest rate even, this amount of population indicates Sub-Saharan Africa might become a center of economic activities. So I think this is the sort of economic reality as shown by statistics. Economic reality I saw on the road from Da Nang to Savannakhet, or Ho Chi Minh City to Phnom Penh, or Tirawa, or Nakala Port in Mozambique, or Chennai in South India. This is the Indo-Pacific. It is going to be the center of economic gravity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have no problems. We have a fair amount of challenges that we have to tackle. One is the security areas. And one important source of security uncertainty is the coming from or implied by the consequences of what we call the rise of China. And from looking from Japan, looking at China's military buildup, this is the sort of picture that Japanese have with respect to the rise of Chinese military. And this is a picture of military expenditures of Japan's and China's interposed with each other. And from the end of the Cold War in 1989 to now, well, this is shown in a constant dollars, US dollar. And Japan's military expenditure was almost complete flat, while China's the military expenditure has shown an exponential growth. And so when the Cold War ended, China's military expenditure was about half Japan's size, and now it's about 4 times as large as Japan's. But of course, I use this graph not to frighten Japanese. because security conditions are more complex and cannot be reduced to bilateral relations. You have to look at the distribution of military power regionally and globally. And so I take some moment to calculate the military expenditures of all China's neighbors, particularly the maritime neighbors, and combine the military expenditures of all China's maritime neighbors, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, Bangladesh, India, and Australia and New Zealand. And if you compare the combined military expenditure of China's maritime neighbors and China, you will have this picture. The combined military forces of China's maritime neighbor was much larger in 1990. And the interesting thing is that China is really catching up. And now China's one country military expenditure is nearly equal to the military expenditures of its maritime neighbors combined. And so I do not indicate a military expenditure determine military balance. A military, strength may not be reducible to simply the amount of money used. But this might indicate somehow that if you try to counter China's military power, all maritime neighbors have to join together in order to match China's single country military expenditure. Well, this might frighten all of you. But this is not my intention, because one important statistic was missing from this picture. That's the military expenditure of the United States. And if you add US military expenditure, you'll have this picture. Very different. And very significant thing is that how big the US military expenditure is as opposed to the others. The scale has changed, and China's maritime neighbors is almost caught up by the Chinese, but US alone has much larger military expenditure. And does this cause you relieved, assured? I'm not so sure, because firstly, the US military expenditure is not deployed only to East Asia or Indo-Pacific. It has to deal with many other things. And also, particularly after the coming of Mr. Trump, the allies of the United States are wondering if the US continues to commit itself to the safety of various parts of the world. And so I think this picture indicates the critical importance of American attention and presence in the Indo-Pacific if we are to have constructive relations with our great neighbor, China, so that we could avoid circumstances where international disputes would not be resolved by force. International disputes, in order for international disputes to be resolved by peaceful means, we need to have stable military balance, so that no one is willing to resort to arms to settle disputed areas. And so this is, I think, the point that the importance of American involvement in the affairs of Indo-Pacific. In order to secure the further prosperity of Indo-Pacific, as previous statistics indicated, we need to have constructive relations with the United States. But of course, the power balance amongst major powers is not the only factor that could affect security situations in the region. Well, this is the battle death that happened in the world since 1990. And as we enter the 21st century, we have lots of red balloons, and then huge balloons in Syria over there. I will show this from 1991, 2, 3. These balloon indicates that there was a big conflict. Well, fortunately, by 2015, the Southeast Asia, we have very fewer balloons, and looking toward southern part of sub-Saharan Africa, we don't see much. But still, the Indo-Pacific, what we call Indo-Pacific, has a lot of conflict areas along their adjacent areas. And so we need to the security situations. And the next, well, I'll skip this. But then next, I would like to show some of the terrorist incidents taking place. And the huge balloon that you saw was 9/11. I'll show you again. This is from 1990. And then the terrorist incidents also, occur various parts of the region. But I would like you to recognize that areas within what we call the Indo-Pacific, we have lots of terrorist incidents. And areas adjacent to Indo-Pacific, we have lots of terrorist incidents. So we need to be attentive to the efforts to reduce terrorist forces. And in order to reduce terrorist forces, military means may not be perfect. We need to do a lot more than military means. We need to conduct socio-economic development so that people are not lured to the solution inspired by extremism. This is the percentage of those who live in the extreme poverty as defined by World Bank and UN agencies. Those people who live on less than $1.9 each day. And fortunately, Southeast Asia, East Asia, as a result of remarkable economic growth, the percentage of those who live in extreme poverty has become smaller. But as you look at the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we have still many countries that have that have 40, 50, 60% of a population under extreme poverty. And so in order for the sort of bright future that Africa with a growing population becoming a economic center, we need to be attentive to reducing the extreme poor. And that's why I think importance that the international community is now focusing on sustainable development goals. I started with my memories of traveling from Da Nang to Savannah Ket or Ho Chi Minh City to Phnom Penh, and then I attended, incidentally, in Cambodia, completion ceremony of the Nek Lun River over the Mekong in Cambodia, which is now called Tsubasa Bridge, and the beginning of Tirawa Industrial Park and the current thriving industrial park in Tirawa. The JICA under the direction of the Japanese government, is expanding its area of collaboration for economic development from East Asia to Southeast Asia, over the Mekong region, to Indian Ocean, India and Sub-Saharan Africa, Nakala Port development. Well, this is the geographic distribution of Japan's ODA. And the blue thing indicate previously in the 1980s and 90s, largest portion went to East Asia and Pacific, East Asia and Southeast Asia. But now the South Asia receive as much as East Asia, and the portion of Sub-Saharan Africa increased greatly. And this figure indicates, I think, the seriousness of what our Prime Minister called free and open Indo-Pacific. The free and open it reflects our values, but free and openness are the basis of economic prosperity that East Asia achieved. And to do that, we need to make efforts to stabilize the region. Firstly, taking care of stable power balance between the rising power of China, as well as attentive to other security challenge coming from terrorism and internal instability by focusing on social economic development. I believe my view is only my view, but I hope this kind of thinking is behind a Japanese perspective, often referred to by our Prime Minister, a free and open Indo-Pacific vision. Thank you very much.
We've been left with a very geostrategic but broad contours of the world going back 1,000 years or so, and looking forward another 200 years or so. So we will just make a little small and quick change of plan here. We're going to keep Professor Tanaka on the stage in a little bit, and then we'll take a round of questions or comments at this time before we proceed to the panel. I'll start with the first question, Professor Tanaka. This is a world system. This is what it means. This is what is meant by world system. World system is you don't look at the Mekong region this year, next year. You look at regions and the world for 1,000 years. So you can see shifts in patterns of development, and you can tease out the data he's got from the different sources and so on. But I want to ask you, you have to reduce this for us a little bit. We have China, Japan. We see the military expenditure not balanced. We have a lot of issues. South China Sea, the Mekong region we're looking at. We have the China-U.S. trade war. To bring it down to the medium term, the next few years, what are we looking at based on the very broad brush that you have presented in a very stimulating fashion?
Well, thank you very much for the question. The U.S.-China relations is one of the subjects I nowadays often asked to give a talk. And today I didn't mention virtually anything on U.S.-China relations. But certainly it is going, in my understanding, it is going to be a defining phenomena of the world system in the coming decades. In my presentation, I assumed that this relations is supposed to be managed so that drastic change would not take place. And I think, and then I think it is possible to prevent U.S.-China relations from spiraling into a disaster as the world saw in the 1930s. My expectation does not necessarily mean that it is going to be an easy issue to resolve. I believe the U.S. policy toward China over the past 30 years was mostly governed by what's called the engagement policy. And the engagement policy, in my understanding, had two premises. One was the premise that as China becomes richer, Chinese become richer, they be expected to become freer. As people's living standard becomes better, then the political system in China would also become more relaxed and more liberalized. And this was the first premise. And now many Americans, it seems to me, have concluded this expectation was misguided. This type of liberalization of political system at least has not taken place, even though the living condition of the Chinese had become much better. But that was this sort of dismay of the first premise was not the only cause of the current U.S.-China relations. I think that I think that there was another premise. Another premise was that even though China does not become democratized, U.S. was supposed to be able to cope with such China in security terms, because the American technological supremacy will not change. And this is the second premise, that the confidence in American technological supremacy is now being doubted unless something is done. And now looking at a very impressive technological development in China and progress made in Chinese companies, Americans are beginning to wonder if this continues, can we preserve the technological edge over China when confronted militarily? And that's, I think, the reason that the U.S. Congress and the Commerce Department singled out Huawei and other Chinese tech companies that they may not operate freely in the U.S. market. And these worries are shared, in my understanding, very widely in American society, both democratic and Republican countries. I think the only unpredictable source is what Mr. President thinks about this. Mr. President appears to think trade figures are a lot more important than this overall assessment of U.S.-China relations. But we don't know what's going to be the deal between the U.S. and China in the coming month or so. But I think the basic premise of the engagement policy is now gone, and then we need to expect that the conflictual tendencies continues in the coming years and maybe decades.
My name is Frank Fu from Guangming, Delhi, China. Currently I'm based in Bangkok. I would like to just now, in the presentation of Professor Tanaka-san, one photo or one graph, I think that impressed the audience is about the military spending, a comparison between China and Japan, in which the photo showed that the military spending for Japan is remain there somewhat stable, while the military spending for China is increased dramatically over the years. But I would like to counter-argue. Did you know what is the percentage of the Chinese military spending versus the GDP?
Well, it's about, I think, 1.6 or 7% per GDP.
Almost there.
Huh?
Almost there. I checked just now. Actually, the military spending of the Chinese is about 1.23% in the year of 2018, and it's a little bit lower in 2019. My argument is that. So actually, if you look at the picture, did you accept this conception? Do you think China is one of the fastest economic growth country in the world over the past 10 or 20 years? So my argument that actually the GDP of China is increasing like in the past decades, in the 1990 to 2000, 8%. And then in the recent years, the development speed decreased while still remain 6% to 7%. So in that sense, please let me finish, Professor. In that sense, the GDP, the total GDP of China is jumping over the past several decades. And in that sense, the military spending groups at the same pace over the decades. And till now, I mean, actually, in the recent years, the military spending compared to GDP in China is decreased if you compare to the percentage.
Okay,
And
Frank,
that
I'm going to
of
have to cut you off there, Frank, because there are others who want to. I think you have raised a point. It's a fair point. So in terms of percentage, because of a growing fast expansion of the breakneck growth of the Chinese economy as a percentage of GDP, maybe it's down. But in fact, as a nominal absolute numbers, absolute budget, it has gone up, I think. Okay, that's a point. That's a fair point. As a percentage of GDP, I need to go to the other two guest participants who want to ask a question or make a comment. Gentleman in the back.
Robert Kinnear, Alternative Innovations. China has fully invested in every of the 54 states of Africa, and you're talking about the sub-Sahara population expanding in due course. I've traveled widely and worked in Africa, so I'm very familiar with the influence of China, but not only in Africa, but also in South America and Central America. China has gone everywhere, fully invested with, and this of course is government policy, central government policy. The rest of the world is going in individually at individual countries, and they've basically they've ignored Africa and all the other countries for the last 50 years. They're only beginning to pick up on the idea that, oops, China is there. So the military spending really has got, I think, perhaps you could comment, is actually rather redundant in these days when the actual war, if you can call it that, is actually a capitalist war, an economic war. And basically China has got the world all wrapped up financially and for the foreseeable future.
Just one question. Is China overall activities internally, externally, and so on, inclusive of the military expenditure? Professor Tanaka, do you think that is sustainable, that it could go on expanding investment, grant aid, backing up the state-owned enterprises to lose money all over inside and outside China and so on? Is that sustainable? Thank you.
To the question, what we're looking at around here, China is phenomenal. It has a very large growing economy. It has its own model, right? It's a kind of a model where you have centralized political control, Communist Party. It's totalitarian in that sense, but at the same time, it's also capitalist. It's engaged in the world economy, so it's having a cake and eating it too. And a lot of countries in the region seeing China, they think, it's kind of appealing. Why not have both? So the question then is that how sustainable is this? You mentioned earlier about this thesis. Normally when you have economic development, you will have pressure for political liberalization. But in fact, in China, it is not happening. but how long term is it sustainable? You look at BRI, it seems like long term, but maybe not. Your answer we're waiting for. And then also, since you talk about FOIP, I mean, FOIP, without Trump, without Abe, where is it going? But without Xi Jinping, I think maybe BRI could outlast Xi Jinping. What do you think?
Well, those are great questions, but I'm not sure if I can answer them in a minute or two. But well, as Professor Thitinan mentioned, I think in one way we may look at the situation in which China is offering a new model than liberal economic development model, in which a country can become prosperous without becoming democratic. And it seems 19th Party Congress, President Xi Jinping appears to have implied that China is offering such a model. And that may be attractive to authoritarian leaders in the world. Probably that's another reason that Americans are becoming very serious about its relations with China. Because now Americans feel that they are being challenged by authoritarian development model. And so much so, Americans are determined to fight, not necessarily in military means, but in order to show the continuing validity of liberal economic development model. Whether two of the models, which would win in the future, we don't know. I personally believe that the authoritarian development model may not be easily able to come over what might be called the middle income trap, or might not be able to sustain really innovative trends of innovations. I think the world genius with huge innovative ideas may not want to live in a country where you cannot speak freely, but that's assumption which may or may not be valid in certain circumstances. But I think the sustainability of China's provision of money all over the world may not be so solid as we sometimes assume. The current account statistics that IMF projected about China indicates some ominous trend that Chinese leaders have to worry. Over the past few years, current account surplus declined tremendously in China. And China's current account surplus is lower than trade surplus. And that means China's service account, I think huge amount of Chinese tourists spend a lot of money around the world. And so that subtracts the trade surplus to lower current account surplus. And then what is troubling to the Chinese is that income account, that's transfer of income from the invested money abroad to the Chinese, has not been growing, and it's nearly zero. And then IMF predicts that by year 2021 or 22, China's current account surplus will vanish. China's current account may become in the negative, which means the reduction of foreign reserve in China. And so by the early 2020s, as the current trend continues, China may not become so lavish about putting all money around the world. And so I think one of the problems of Chinese investment abroad is that they are not very profitable. Well, in JICA has made lots of projects around the world by concessional loans. Thanks to the successful management of those projects, JICA has very little time receiving repayment. and we always were repaid. Particularly, loan from Thailand. Thailand is very successful in repaying, and so we are okay. But in recent Chinese, experiences in Sri Lanka, Hamban Tota, or Chinese projects in Djibouti to Addis Ababa, both recipient countries had really difficulty in paying back. And some say that this is a Chinese deliberate attempt of, debt trap. But that may not be the case. The projects itself may not have been so effective. And so there may be some, basis to believe that China's current trend of lavishly spending around the world may not continue so long.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Tanaka.